Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode 5. Let's talk about it. So Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode 5 picks up right where we left off in episode 4, where we got that incredible ending where we saw John Walker lose the plot entirely and kill a man in cold blood in front of everyone in the middle of a town square where people were filming him with their 4K cameras. It was truly just a catastrophic event that was bound to happen. We already know that it was pretty much inevitable for this character's journey, but still seeing that outcome was absolutely incredible. And honestly, one of the most striking scenes that we've seen throughout this entire series is that upshot of John Walker holding the shield that is covered in the blood of that innocent man. So that scene really left us with so much to think about for the entirety of this week, and I was just counting down the minutes, the seconds, the milliseconds until we could dive into episode 5. And I'm happy to say that episode 5 did not disappoint, because a lot of the qualms, a lot of the questions that I'd raised in my review of episode 4 was starting to be unpacked and started to be answered in episode 5. So I can't wait to delve into my thoughts on this episode. But as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado, let's dive into my thoughts on this episode. The first kind of theme or character that we're going to be delving into for this review is John Walker, okay? Because we need to address the mess that this man has become, the true and utter mess that he has become as a result of taking the serum, but also as a result of his personality not really being perfect, okay, not being fundamentally good to begin with, okay, because the serum merely amplified what was already there. And after having watched Captain America the First Avenger again this week, I have a true appreciation for how fundamentally important that film is for setting up the lore that is explored in this series. It really did come in handy for giving me a lot more context for a lot of the stuff that is explored in this series, and in particular this episode, which is very interesting. Like, I watched it right in the nick of time. But in the case of John Walker, his story very much mirrors that of the soldier that the government was going to choose in Captain America the First Avenger, and before Dr. Erskine insisted that Steve Rogers be the candidate for the serum. So I think it's really interesting to see what would have become of that soldier had he taken the serum. You know, all of the personality defects and the parts of him that don't make him a great person are kind of amplified, and we see that to this hugely detrimental effect when John Walker loses his absolute mind and kills someone in the middle of the street, okay, caught on 4K, okay, and he's still in denial about this when we meet him in episode 5, where he's telling Sam and Bucky, like, I had to do this, okay, this is just part of being Captain America, okay, like, why are you making me do this? As he fights them, as he throws the punches, he's telling them, why are you making me do this, refusing to take any responsibilities for his actions. It is just shocking and infuriating to see, but those are the tendencies that were underlying in his personality that have just been amplified because of the serum. Now, in terms of the fight sequence that we do get at the beginning of this episode, I thought it was sick. Like, I thought it was I thought it was great. Like, what can I say? Okay, seeing Sam and Bucky fight against John Walker, you know Bucky's been waiting for this. You know Bucky's been wanting to do this since literally the second he laid eyes on that man. You know, before the fight even starts, John Walker's literally like, you don't want to do this, and Bucky's like, actually, funny story, yeah. I do. I've been wanting to do this. Even when they were in Germany, or at least in the skies of Germany on the plane, where Sam was like, well, what do you want me to do? Like, we can't go out and fight him and take the shield from him. And Bucky was like, that's absolutely what we could do. Because for Bucky, the shield is something that, you know, is precious. It's something that Steve Rogers held, okay, and all of the implications of that, all of the symbolism of that is what makes Bucky so dedicated to the shield and the symbolism that's associated with it, that came from the goodness calmness and the leadership of his best friend. So it is a big deal to him, and seeing it covered in the blood of this victim must infuriate him and must make him feel like he's let Steve down for even allowing that to happen. And so yeah, his priority is getting the shield back from John Walker. Whereas Sam's priority is trying to de-escalate the situation. I noticed that throughout the series we're really starting to see Sam as someone who approaches things with a little bit more tact and someone who wants to get to someone's psyche a little bit more. He doesn't just see his opponents as people to kick and punch, like he first tries to address them on a personal level. But unfortunately that doesn't quite work with John Walker because he's past the point of reason at that point, and he sees whatever Sam is doing as manipulation instead of Sam trying to understand him on a psychological level. And that's when things kind of blow up and we get this action sequence in this kind of warehouse setting that we've seen in the trailers, and I think it was really cool to see them battle it out. It also felt really brutal. Like this this action sequence was brutal, okay? Bucky's nose bleeding and he was, you know, spitting out blood. Like, it was intense. I will say though, if there was one moment that actually made me gasp and actually made me fuming, okay, it was the moment where John Walker got his grimy little hands on Sam's wings and tore them off. I was like, ooh. I was like, no, not in Kevin Feige's Marvel is John Walker gonna be able to tear Sam's wings off. Who gave him the right? Oh my god, I was fuming. And also I couldn't help but notice there being some sort of analogy about angels and heaven and demons ripping off their wings. You know, there's something there in the subtext. You guys can let me know what you find in the subtext of that scene, but I just found it to be so striking, okay, and so unnerving to see Sam in such a vulnerable position. But I was happy to see that Bucky had his back, even if it was to get the shield back from this crazed demon, okay, who was ripping off people's wings. And in the end, Sam literally had to break his arm. Like, he literally had to pry it out of his arm in order to get it back, which just goes to show just how hard it was for him to get it back, even though it had been so easy for him to give it away. But when it comes to the shield itself, the thing that they were fighting over, really, one of the major themes throughout this series has been the true meaning and the symbolism of that shield. And as I mentioned before, you know, Bucky is very much invested in the symbolism of the shield because of its association with Steve. In Captain America: The First Avenger, Bucky tells Steve, I'm not going to be following you because you're Captain America. I'm following you because you're the kid from Brooklyn who didn't know how to run away from a fight. You always stood up for what was right and what you thought was right and good, and that's the person that I want to follow as my leader. And we've already seen, as I mentioned before in a previous review, that Bucky has kind of instinctively done that with Sam as well throughout this entire mission, okay? Even though they said that they're going to split up after the mission and whatever, but Bucky has been on this ride even though no one invited him, okay? And it's because Sam is that very same leader. He sees in Sam what he saw in Steve, and so to see the shield in the hands of someone like John Walker, it really irked him. But then you also get that moment where Sam gets the shield back and it is covered in that blood, and his first reaction is to kind of wipe the blood away. It's such a small moment, but again, it plays into that overall theme of what the shield is supposed to symbolize and whether or not the symbol of the shield actually matches its new recipient, which is of course Sam Wilson. So after that fight ends, when we next see John Walker, he is headed towards this government building waiting for his fate to be told to him, because the government, the army, the institution, okay, in charge of all of this is telling him what his verdict is. They're telling him what his punishment is as a result of his atrocious actions, being caught on camera, because let's be real, as he points out himself, he said this in last week's episode and in this episode, that he has done some pretty, you know, horrible things all in the name of fighting for his country as a soldier, and he was really good at following the orders that they gave him. And so the idea that all of a sudden him doing those same things that he likely did in order to earn him the medals to begin with to be Captain America would all of a sudden be punishable because they were caught on camera is something that he finds difficult to kind of reconcile with. Though of course the circumstances are different, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I do think it's interesting how the series is kind of treading into the realm of criticizing the way that soldiers are treated in the army and in the armed forces forces. So there is a little bit of critique of the military industrial complex there. It's light. The commentary is very light, okay? The commentary on this subject matter is very surface level. We get a few scenes, a few lines from John Walker, but in comparison to some of the other social issues that this series tries to tackle, its criticism of the military industrial complex is not really a priority, okay? But it's there. The sprinklings of it are there, especially through the character of John Walker. But another thing that I did, of course, want to note about this entire scenario was just the hypocrisy of it all. Other than the fact that, of course, the US Army would punish him for doing what he already done and gotten medals for in Afghanistan. Like, that's the hypocrisy that we've already discussed. But I'm talking about the hypocrisy of how they treated John Walker for doing the most heinous thing, like literally ever, in the public eye, I must reiterate, to how they treated Isiah Bradley. Because wow, night and day, because John Walker ultimately didn't even get a dishonorable discharge. He got like an other than honorable discharge. He wasn't court-martialed. Like, after all of that, and they say it's because of his reputation, but someone like Isiah Bradley, even with that reputation, if he would even get those medals, would not have been afforded those same luxuries. Would not have been given any room. Isiah Bradley would not have been given any benefit of the doubt. Like, literally during this trial, the senator was like, oh, it's only because I took your credentials into consideration and your previous reputation into consideration. That's why you're not getting a dishonorable discharge. No one would have been on Isiah's team like that. No one. Because no one. Literally, he would have been on his own. It would have been him against them. And that's exactly what happened. And we'll discuss his case later on in this review. But I just wanted to point that out here, how John has been treated by the US government. Like, yes, he's facing consequences, but nowhere near the scale, the scope of consequences that Isiah had to endure as a black soldier. So it's during this trial that John Walker actually walks out, okay? Just as the senator is talking about how he's been so disrespectful, my guy just walks out. As he's saying this, okay, he's like, I've had enough, and his wife follows him out, and they are soon joined by, I guess, the major cameo of this series, who is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who portrays the character of Valentina Allegra de Fontaine. Okay, she's apparently a countess of some sort, although she looks like an edgy countess, and she approaches John Walker with a proposal that's very vague, but it's given me Thunderbolts vibes, okay? I've seen kind of speculation surrounding whether or not John Walker would end up being part of the Thunderbolts, who are this kind of evil equivalent to the Avengers, these kind of bad guys who end up teaming up to be this kind of counterpoint to the Avengers because they want to go at being seen as the good guys. It's all about the perspective, but in reality they have nefarious intentions and whatnot. So that's the kind of scenario that they may be setting up for the character of John Walker through this series. Another tidbit of information that Valentina drops for us is something that made me smile. Valentina says that not only does she know that John Walker doesn't have the shield, but in the case of the shield overall, its ownership by the US government is a legal grey area. What does that does that sound familiar to you? If you watched my review last week, then all of you guys should have been smiling along with me, because what did I tell you? What did I tell you? Give the shield back to Wakanda. I told you it doesn't belong to the US government. It doesn't belong to Steve Rogers. It doesn't belong to anyone but the people of Wakanda, because that vibranium was stolen. Give it back. Now, it's during this scene, after John Walker has walked right away from his own trial, that his wife, who apparently is still by his side even after the atrocities that he committed, advises him to take things slow, okay, to take things one at a time, and he needs to focus on the next task in hand, which is to go to Lamar's parents and tell them the news personally. And so that's exactly what he does next up in the episode, and we see that confrontation that he has with Lamar's parents, where they are just so sad, okay, about the death of their son. They're really mourning his loss, and honestly it is a pretty emotional scene, and you can see how John Walker himself is affected by it and by their reaction. But to me, like, I could already tell how this was going to go, because it's not a case of John actually listening to what they're saying, but rather hearing what he already wanted to here, because Lamar's parents assume that the person that John Walker killed in cold blood, in broad daylight, was the person who killed their son, and he just goes along with it anyways, because of course he doesn't want to sully his reputation in their eyes. So he just tells them, like, yeah, that is the person. And so of course you have Lamar's mother saying, I'm so glad that you avenged our son, and that you ended up killing, I mean, she doesn't say this, but you ended up killing the person who killed him, like an eye for an eye sort of thing, because she's in grief, like she's in mourning, not knowing that that wasn't the person who killed her son. And not only that, but now that John Walker has heard those words coming from her mouth, that's what he's going to use to justify what comes next. And what comes next is nothing but pain and suffering. Nothing but pain and suffering. Of course he's going to go after Carly. He was already going to go after Carly, but he's gotten the validation from Lamar's family, which is sick and disgusting. And speaking of Lamar himself, I didn't quite give him the spotlight that he deserved in last week's episode, because so much was happening, and honestly so much is happening now still. But since I recently rewatched Captain America the First Avenger, as I said, I did notice a cute little parallel between Lamar and the character of Gabe, who is the sole black howling commando in that film, in that they both can speak German. Like, they both speak German, and it's a shock both times. And I feel like once again this plays into the idea that, you know, Lamar was better qualified to be Captain America to begin with. As I've been saying from the get-go, it seemed as though he had a better understanding of the role. He also seemed a little bit more equipped in terms of the different languages that he knew how to speak. And initially in my review, when I was talking about this, I mentioned how Steve knew how to speak different languages. But in actuality, the direct nod that we get here is from the character of Gabe, who, like I said, was the Black Howling Commando in Steve's original lineup. But lastly, and arguably most importantly, the reason why Lamar would have been more equipped to be Captain America and to take the super soldier serum is because in last week's episode, we did see this kind of conversation that he had with John Walker, where John asks him if he would take the serum, and his immediate reaction is yes, absolutely, which is in large contrast to Sam's response to that same question when he's asked by Zemo. But in the case of Lamar, he says yes because he has nothing to worry about in his mind, because even though he's aware that, you know, his traits would be amplified by the serum, he's confident enough in his, you know, personhood and the person and the man that he is, that he doesn't see that as an issue, whereas you see that hesitation in John Walker. So I find it to be a very interesting contrast between the characters, and it's also playing into the overall theme of who is deemed worthy to be Captain America in the eyes of the US government. Again, we'll dive into that later on when we talk about the role of Isiah Bradley in this story. But also, as well as having that small little similarity to the character of Gabe, Lamar himself represents a larger kind of group of characters that we've seen in media overall, but of course in comic book related media specifically, and that is of course the black best friend, the black sidekick character. Okay, I find it really interesting how when John Walker visits Lamar's parents, his mother talks about how proud he was of John and how happy he was to be, you know, working with John as his sidekick. Like, I find that very interesting because it's still kind of playing into that trope and the idea that he himself couldn't have been a leader. But anyways, I do find it interesting how at the same time Marvel seems to be lampshading the idea that, you know, oh, look at all these black sidekick characters, like that's just atrocious, and the idea that John Walker would insist on calling Sam a partner that he could have worked with him being Captain America and Sam being the sidekick, which is just wholly insulting. But at the same time, in a kind of meta way, Marvel themselves were guilty of this. Like, they might be lampshading it now and highlighting this issue now, but they themselves created, or at least they were a part of perpetuating said issue through the character of Sam Wilson and Rhodey. Like, they did this. They did this to themselves in a lot of ways. Now, speaking of Sam, after his little tiff with Fake Cap, okay, he ends up meeting with Torres, who informs him that they've basically been benched, okay? They've been benched because of the severity of what Walker did. The government can no longer ignore it. it can no longer go under the rug. So they basically have to take over the case entirely, and that means that Sam and Torres can't operate in the way that they were previously. So Sam has basically been benched here. He no longer has jurisdiction on the matter because they've taken over. And so he's just kind of coming to terms with that, and he's like, you know, what's my next step now? With Bucky just kind of hanging behind him. Bucky goes out to deal with the Zemo of it all. Okay, the Zemo situation, that's kind of the elephant in the room. And then you have Torres kind of walking up to Sam's wings and being like, oh my god, what happened? My reaction exactly. But interestingly enough, Sam decides to leave the wings behind with Torres, which tells me that they might be seeding in the idea that he could perhaps in the future be a Falcon himself, because the character is a version of the Falcon in the comics. So that's a little nod to that perhaps. But Sam ends up leaving the place with the shield in hand, and where he heads off to is right back to Baltimore to get more answers on the symbolism surrounding this shield. So he heads back to Baltimore, where he sees Eli playing basketball with a friend on the streets, and he is of course Isiah's grandson, and he is kind of rumored to become a Patriot at some point in time when they do the Young Avengers, which would be really fun to see. But this whole part of this episode was really just something else, because I said I said last week that one of the things that I really wanted the show to delve into, like directly addressing the issues that it has kind of been touching on throughout the series, is this issue of race. Because yes, at the end of the day, the symbol of the shield does not mean the same thing for everyone. The shield doesn't represent the same set of values for everyone, and putting it in the hands of a black man like Sam, especially a black man from the South, okay, really does have a different meaning in comparison to what it did stand for in the hands of a Steve Rogers, who's this perfect embodiment of the Aryan race that they had to fight against Hitler, which is an interesting kind of commentary there. But anyways, I was so happy to see that the series was going to directly address this issue and mince no words about it. However, that didn't make this scene any easier to watch, because I was just so overwhelmed with emotion during that scene. I mean, it was incredible, first and foremost, okay? The actors were doing the actoring. The fact that Anthony Mackie could convey the nervousness before he even stepped into Isiah's house, like he was actually nervous. He took in this big deep breath because he knew what was about to come was just pain and suffering. And then you have that interaction with Isiah, who is just so disillusioned with the idea of Captain America and the shield. He sees the circular bag that Sam's kind of carrying around with him, and he knows immediately what it is, and he's not even interested in looking in its direction. Like, he's like, don't even bother, you know, unveiling the shield in front of me. I don't even want to look at it, because all of the wholesome American values that people claim the shield stands for don't apply to people like him, so he's not even interested in looking at it. But then we get the full story of Isiah Bradley, and this was the part that genuinely just surprised me, because I thought that what we'd seen of Isiah in episode 2 was the entirety of what we were going to get for this series, and I already explained in my review of episode 2 the kind of backstory to Isiah and to this black Captain America that is a part of the Truth Marvel series in the comics, and this episode in itself is actually called Truth, I'm guessing as a nod to that comic book series, which is just incredible. But the fact that they really spelt it out, the fact that we really stuck to the origins that we see in the comics of these 332 black soldiers who are experimented on, and they suffer these horrible side effects of these different serums that they get against their will, because the scientists tell them that they're actually receiving these kind of like tetanus samples. And again, I already mentioned this in my review of episode 2, but it very much mirrors the story of the Tuskegee experiments that were real life experiments, and some of the most atrocious and unethical experiments to ever be carried out pretty much in history, okay, but certainly in American history. So the parallels there are already atrocious. But to see this scene play out between these two black characters in the MCU, I never could have thought. I'm telling you, I've been waiting for this series for like two and a half years since it was announced in like 2018, but I never could have expected to see a scene like that. Like, they just went for it, and I'm so glad that they did. But like I said, it didn't make it any easier to watch that scene, because it was absolutely heartbreaking. Oh my god, both actors were doing the actoring necessary to convey the emotions emotions, the regret, the frustration, Sam's genuine just... Oh, his reaction was just so visceral. I was like, yes, Sam, this is all of us. This is all of us hearing these horrible, horrible stories. But not only that, as I mentioned, and as I keep mentioning in this review, I recently rewatched Captain America: The First Avenger. I was reminded of Captain America's first official mission, one that he imposed upon himself, and that was to save his friend Bucky from being tortured by Hydra, okay, on the other side of enemy lines. And he also managed to save like 200 of Bucky's like group, like I can't remember the name for the group of soldiers that he was in. It was like the 107th something, but he saved them all, and he was seen as like a hero for doing so. He was lauded as the hero, as Captain America the hero, as a result of this. And so to hear a very similar story be told by Isiah Bradley, but with very different results. He tried to save his friends that were in his little group. I can't remember the name for it. He had been trying to save the other black soldiers who had also been experimented on, who he considered to be his brothers, just as Steve had considered Bucky to be his brother. He was trying to save them, and the establishment wanted to just blow them up to get rid of the evidence, but he didn't see them as evidence. He saw them as people. He saw them as his brothers, as I said. And instead of receiving that same, lauding of praise, being called a hero, anything that Steve Rogers received when he returned with 200 soldiers behind him, instead Isiah ended up getting locked up for 30 years and used as a guinea pig for the super soldier serum. And the only way that he was able to get out of those circumstances, not because he reached the end of his prison sentence, like imagine that, not because of that, but because a nurse kindly, did him a kindness in declaring him dead. That's the only way that he could leave, is if he was literally dead. And so that's what the nurse did. The nurse figuratively put him out of his misery by declaring him dead and therefore allowing him to live the rest of his life as a dead person. This is all so messed up. This is all so outrageous. And so Sam's now listening to this story and thinking, oh, okay, I get it now. Because he wanted to get to the bottom of things. He wanted to understand where it all went wrong. And he understands racism clearly. He's like, I'm a man from the South. I know, about the burning crosses and everything. But hearing that story, Sam's like, okay, this is different. And you can see the disgust, you can see the horror in Sam's face. And so he's starting to understand where this man is coming from when he doesn't even want to look at the shield, because all the stuff that it's supposed to represent clearly does not apply to him and others like him. That's one of the major reasons why I predict that Sam Wilson probably won't end up being Captain America. I think, this is just my theory that I've made up in my head. I think he should end up being like Captain Falcon, okay? I think that's what's going to happen, where you take away the association with American values that don't necessarily apply to all people living in America, unfortunately, and you just put in the Falcon, okay, because he is the Falcon. I think that's the kind of compromise that they're going to reach. Now, we didn't end up getting to see his suit by the end of the episode, so I'd be very interested to see whether it reflects the kind of Captain Falcon isms that I'm thinking of, or if it leans more towards Captain America. I don't think it will, though, because it was made in Wakanda, so they wouldn't make him a Captain America suit. I'd be very interested to see the suit that he ends up wearing. I do think it's going to be the compromise of Captain Falcon. Let me know what you guys think of that label. I don't know if it's like in the comics or anything. I literally just thought of it. I was like, Captain Falcon, that makes sense. So let me know what you guys think of that one. So after that incredibly dramatic and gut-wrenching scene, we do get to have a little bit of a comedic-ish break, because Sam does head back to Louisiana, where he has to address the boat of it all. The boat situation with his sister Sarah, where he is trying to help Sarah prepare the boat for sale, except he learns that the person who was supposed to buy the boat off of them has backed out because it's in such disarray that it would cost him more to fix up the boat than any actual benefit that he could get from it. His nephews reveal this to him when he's kind of fixing up the boat with them. And he kind of addresses this with Sarah later on, who tells him, like, listen, there's nothing that I can do. Okay, it's going to be really expensive to fix up that boat. It's going to cost us more than we would actually make from it. And so Sam calls in a few favors from the community, from the neighbors that he lives nearby, in order to kind of help out with the boat and kind of return the favors that they'd gotten from their parents. And I think that was really touching to see the community come together to help out the Wilson family. And one person even says that, like, you know, the Wilson clan came calling and we came right over because, you know, you guys are such an integral part of our community. And that's kind of established as well when we see Sarah packing lunches for her kids, but she also wants to make sure that these other kids whose father's kind of neglectful of them, I guess, also get fed. So it's just this really touching moment where we get to see Sam's background and we get an understanding of why he is the way that he is, why he's such a caring and compassionate person who wants to understand people who come from a disadvantaged background, people like Carly, of course. It's because of his background himself and because of the way that his family kind of raised him. Even though we're not formally introduced to Sam's parents, Darlene and Paul, we can kind of get an introduction into who they were through the effect that they had on the community and the fact that everyone was so willing to come in and chip in with the boat and help them out so that they could sell it. However, as useful as some of the Louisiana crew can be, they can't do it all, okay? They can't do all of the heavy lifting. And so that's when that's when we get the entry of none other than Bucky himself. Okay, he's just come back from Sokovia, which we'll talk about in a second. But can I just say, from here on out, okay, this whole Louisiana scene, nothing but smile. I was so happy that we finally got a scene with just Sam and Bucky being best buds, okay, fixing the boat, doing manly things and fixing the boat. Listen, I'd be lying to you. I'd be lying to you and insulting your intelligence if I didn't admit that I liked the scene visually of them fixing the boat. Like, I can appreciate the aesthetic is all I'm saying. But anyways, I really enjoyed this scene. This is exactly what I'd signed up for when I heard that this show was being made. I was so excited to see the banter between the characters, and I like the fact that this time around they seem to be leaning more towards the friends side of frenemies than enemies, which we've seen in the previous episodes, because they have been quite antagonistic against each other. I will say by the end of this whole sequence they seem to be quite buddy-buddy. Like, there's a bit of a jump there, okay, in comparison to where they started off at the beginning of the episode. I do think overall this series could have used a couple of more episodes to really flesh out some of the storylines, particularly with the Flagsmashers, as I've been saying from the beginning. But also with Sam and Bucky's friendship, it surprisingly took a bit of a back seat in favor of focusing on the plot, which I don't know who gave them the idea that that was a priority. I don't care about the plot. I was just looking to see them, okay? But that kind of took a bit of a back seat, and so we ended up kind of rushing to the end game, which is them being best buds. But when it happens, it's just sight to my heart. I loved seeing them working together. Are you kidding me? And then you have Bucky flirting with Sarah. Oh my god. Marvel woke up and said, "Good morning to black women only." I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, everyone else. Bucky flirting with Sarah made my whole year. Bucky doesn't just come along to help Sam fix up the boat. He does have a delivery, okay, a parcel to deliver. Apparently he's working for Amazon part-time. And so he does give Sam this huge kind of box, okay, this Wakandan style box that houses his new suit or his new wings. We're not sure yet. We see him gazing at it at the end of the episode. So I'm guessing we're going to see the big reveal in next week's episode. I find it funny how Bucky still had the gall, still had the audacity, or should I say caucasity, to ask the Dora Milaje for yet another like favor. Like, my guy, you're already on rocky grounds right now, okay? But he had the audacity to ask them for a favor, even though it was on behalf of Sam. But still, like, my guy. I wonder if he like crossed Sam's name off of his list. Maybe Bucky was trying to make amends with Sam as well. Maybe Sam is also on his list of names. Like, cause didn't he? Well, he tried to kill Sam many times during Captain America: The Winter Soldier, but didn't he take down one of Sam's wings in that film as well? That would make sense if he was like, okay, you know, in exchange exchange for the old wing that I took down as the Winter Soldier, I'm going to get you a new one from Wakanda. But still, the audacity of asking for another favor when he's already in hot water is hilarious to me. But later on, after some time has passed, we do see them practicing with the shield together in the scenes that we've seen in a lot of the trailers that have come out. And it turns out that this little scene is kind of this like moment of catharsis for the two, where Bucky finally apologizes. He finally apologizes for the way that he's been treating Sam throughout this series, constantly banging on about Sam giving away the shield. Like, yes, it was a bad idea to give it away, but that doesn't mean that he was obliged to keep it in the first place. And I'm so glad that he said explicitly that he and Steve couldn't have even imagined the implications of a black man like Sam taking that shield and therefore taking on all of the symbolism that it has. I think it's so important that he actually said that explicitly, and they actually followed through with that theme of the show. And I was so happy when it happened. It was a brief discussion, okay? I still think we need therapy. I still think that I can act as the mediator for said therapy, okay? And I think we would all get a lot out of it. But in terms of what can be done now, okay, with only one episode to go, I think this is a great start. And like I said, I was so happy to see the best buds becoming best buds, even though they keep denying it. With Bucky helping Sam with his form, okay, with the shield, and Sam putting his counselor skills to use. As the show keeps mentioning, Sam, of course, was a counselor for vets, and he starts to put some of that to use to Bucky, where he tries to explain to Bucky the issue with putting so much importance over what Steve thought of him and Steve's perception of him and his journey, when in reality he should be focusing on defining himself and who he wants to be in the future. And making amends just to feel better about himself isn't necessarily going to take him in that direction, which I found to be an interesting kind of observation that Sam made there. I slightly disagree. I slightly disagree, not with the idea that Bucky has been trying to make amends for his own benefit, and that's kind of counterproductive. Like, I agree with that point, but I do slightly disagree with the show kind of overlooking the fact that Bucky's not to blame for what happened to him ultimately. He doesn't really owe anyone anything. If anything, a lot is owed to him. He's the victim here as well. So I feel like Sam just kind of mentioning that Bucky shouldn't feel this kind of guilt inside of him for what he did during his time as the Winter Soldier, because even though he was the weapon that was being used, he had no control over himself and he had no autonomy. And I think that really does need to be emphasized in the situation. But other than that, like, I approve. I approve of the therapy session that they had. As Bucky himself said, good talk, okay, because they really needed to have that talk, and I think Sam was the perfect person to have that talk with. But then we get this kind of training montage with Sam where he has finally accepted his role as the new Captain America. Again, I don't know if he's going to be assuming the title of Captain America specifically. I suspect it's going to be something else, but who knows? Sam deserves it at the end of the day, okay? He's no longer just Steve Rogers' bestie, okay, his second bestie. He is a character in his own right, a superhero in his own right, so he deserved his little training montage. And I think, Auntie Mackie looking great. Listen, I'm over here looking respectfully, okay, but I couldn't help but notice that the scenery was aesthetically pleasing, is all I'm saying. Now, going back to Bucky and his little trip to Sokovia, we did get what I suspect to be the final scene of the show with Zemo, where Bucky and Zemo have this kind of confrontation, and again, Zemo kind of emphasizes the fact that Bucky was basically programmed to be a killing machine, and that was what Hydra wanted him to be, and he was very good at doing it. And there is a bit of a parallel there with the character of John Walker and how he was essentially programmed by the US Army, the military, to be a killing machine as well, and they gave him medals for it, and now they're kind of punishing him for it. Again, all of these themes kind of playing together really well. But in the case of Bucky, obviously he had no control over his body, he had no control over his mind, so the circumstances are a little bit different, but still Zemo sees him as this kind of being that was programmed to kill. But he himself opens up the discussion with, "I've decided not to kill you," which is fun. Like, I feel like that's the closest that Zemo's going to get to saying, I may not have been 100% right about 100% of super soldiers, because the fact that he's admitted, like, okay, I want to kill all super soldiers, I want to get rid of them all, but maybe you're okay. Like, yeah, it seems as though they bonded sometime around during their little trip to Latvia. So I'm happy. Okay, I'm happy that their relationship has gone to that point where Zemo doesn't want to kill him anymore. But Bucky has other ideas because he's come with a gun. He's come with a gun. He's like, you may not want to kill me, phew, but I have other plans. But it turns out he's not going to kill him either because he's not that person anymore. What I found really interesting is, first of all, the Dora Milaje came to collect. Okay, the Dora Milaje came to collect because they always will. But secondly, Zemo says that he crossed off his name in Bucky's book of, you know, people that he wants to make amends to. And that's just hilarious to me. Not only did he take Bucky's book, but he was editing. He was editing. But yes, the Dora Milaje end up taking Zemo away, and it seems as though he's headed towards the Raft. And again, we have yet another example of a white man who did horrible things, ended up getting let off pretty lightly in comparison to what he did, because Zemo, come to think of it, you know, when they mentioned the Raft, he should have been there from the very beginning. He should have been. Why wasn't he on the Raft from the very beginning? That makes no sense. Like, he literally killed a head of state at the UN. Like, if that head of state had been like the head of like America or like the UK, do you know what I mean? Like, if the head of state had been the head of state of a different country in a different continent, he would have been under the Raft, is all I'm saying. And lastly, we have the Flagsmashers. Now, you guys already know on this channel, we're not the biggest fans of the Flagsmashers, and you know, this week didn't really change my mind on that. We see Carly is very upset because a lot of the camps that she had a community in have been raided as a result of everything that happened in episode 4, and it seems as though the GRC are really kind of doubling down on this. Is it a patch agreement where they would displace up to 20 million refugees back to their countries of origin, despite the fact that they built lives in different countries when the world was just, you know, one world, and they were trying to help each other out during the snapping. So Carly's actions in a way have kind of expedited the process that was likely already going to happen under the GRC, but still, she's basically made it worse in a shorter period of time. And so the GRC are going to have this vote where they decide, you know, what to do with these refugees, but ultimately the members of the GRC are shown to have been, you know, already made their minds up, and they're ready to deploy soldiers and troops in order to make this thing happen. Like, it's gonna be a disaster for these poor people. And so, you know, we understand already Carly's kind of motivations, and we understand that her cause is in the right place. It's just her methods. It seems as though her methods are getting further and further out of hand because she is teaming up with people like Batroc, like, oh, through Sharon Carter. I don't know what Sharon is doing, by the way. I guess that Sharon was the power broker, but I don't know if that makes sense because she's now working with Carly. I don't know what's going on with Sharon. We'll find out in next week's episode. But yeah, now Carly is teaming up with criminals, as her friend mentions. Like, she's gone off the deep end as well. It was more of a gradual leap, but she's gone off now on the deep end. So her methods are just unjustifiable at this point. I mean, they already were, but now it's like you're the villain, basically, and which is a shame because ultimately I feel like the problem that this series is kind of dodging around is that while Sam and Bucky are the good guys, who are they fighting for really? They seem to be fighting for the status quo, because in the case of Carly, the way that she's going about things is obviously wrong. We've already said that her cause is right, but her methods aren't. But at the same time, the GRC aren't in the right here. They're like on the opposite side of this argument, and ethically speaking, what they're doing is atrocious. So who are Sam and Bucky kind of fighting on the side of? Because they're the good guys, but what exactly is their cause? I'm really interested to see if next week's episode is going to explain that, or if they're just going to end up beating up Carly and sending her over to the authorities, but at the same time the 20 million refugees are still going to be displaced from their home of 5 years. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode 5, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.